Excellent. Wonderful to be back again. Again, the first Thursday of every month. Welcome back to the Dunning Africa Center webinar series hosted by the Henley Business School. This is where we start conversations that matter between intellectuals, academics, policymakers, and generally thought leaders across the continent. So we want to bring up issues that matter for Africa, for African business, moving forward and in the long term. This is the place to be at, folks, and I'm really glad those of you who could join us today have done so. Today we are back to a topic we started dealing with a couple of months ago. That is the African Continental Free Trade Area, which and we had the good fortune of having Andrew Mould, who's again back today, and Francis Mageni also back today. The two of them are writing what we expect to be a show-stopping book on the subject of the free trade agreement and what to expect from it and where we're going with it. But today our focus is on a particular aspect of the agreement, and that is the issue of investment. And there's been a lot of talk, as many of you may have already have heard, about the effect that the agreement will have on flows of FDI and the growth of multinational investment. So these are issues that are important for us at various levels. And on this occasion, we have added a third member to our illustrious team, Ziad Hamoui, who is also something of an expert in this area. And he's based out of Ghana, and he's what we would call a true Pan-Africanist. Wait until you hear what he has to say. He provides a new spark to this conversation. So we're looking forward to hearing from him as well. So first, I want to say a little bit for the people in the audience who may not necessarily know that much about FDI and the issue of investment, just as a kind of introduction. So one of the things that I think is a well-established fact now is that countries need investment, and investment is essential in the form of FDI or multinational investment to promote growth. Economic development, industrialization, structural transformation all rely on the flow of investment. So free trade agreements like globalization depend upon the increased the mobility of goods, services, capital, and people. These are the four legs, really, that that's what we look at when we talk about regional integration schemes or global integration processes. But investment really plays a key role. Investment, of course, goes hand in hand with the way in which it is directed, utilized for strategic purposes by government policies by the state. So there's a kind of a partnership between the state and multinationals, which has to be a complementary type of partnership. And it's a subject that, we can see many countries failing to find this complementarity and not seeing the full benefit of investment, inward investment. And we are seeing countries that have managed to make this work, and we see the benefits of such inward investment. Now, we also see regional economic integration as something that has happened in a number of places fairly successfully. The European Union, we can see what was originally the North American Free Trade Area. We have Mercosur, we have ASEAN. We have a number of agreements at different levels, and something that, we are now in Africa, we're following the same path in a sense. We're trying to see how regional economic integration is going to affect us. And now today we are focusing on investment, because we know that regional integration sees an increase in investment. Some say 25%. I'm not willing to put a number on this, but we will, and we are going to see definitely an increase in investment. But we also see a redirection of investment flows. That is, because of integration, they may or may not be a case where there'll be investment diversion. That is to say, investment that was taking place in a particular country, because it becomes a single market, will then get directed either to, if it's a market-seeking investment, towards the largest market, or if it depends upon cheap low wages, it moves toward the lowest wage. So there can be a fair amount of economic restructuring when this happens. So often you can see winners and losers. Not everybody will gain necessarily from the increased investment flows. There's also a process whereby some countries may actually have a loss of investment. So having said this, I mean, there also the conversation now, we are talking a lot about supply chains and global value chains, and the conversation nowadays is about regional value chains in light of the pandemic, that people are talking about the need for developing regional value chain, for instance, within intra-African value chains. So are we going to see an increase in intra-African FDI, and to what extent is that practical and possible? And of course, it's going to vary quite considerably by industry and by country. So, I mean, this is in a way, by way of providing a little bit of a primer on some of the issues that matter and that we're going to talk about today. So I think I've spoken enough to really introduce you guys to what we are interested in talking about today. And what are what I want to do now is move to our gifted analysts that we have invited here. I'm going to turn to them one by one and ask them, so what do you see? What are the stylized facts? What do you see as how would you want to see this investment agreement coming out? What do you see as the benefits? What do you see as the optimistic scenario here? Let's start with Francis.
Thank you very much, Raj. And once again, congratulations on this event. I think we've come to expect them to be legendary, and we can expect nothing less of you, given your stature and track record, and your team as well. Now, as you have said in your introductory remark, this is a very, very important area which we need to watch very carefully. Obviously, it's at the center of the discourse on development, socioeconomic transformation. And talking about the African Continental Free Trade Area, we want it to be a tool for development. So that's why we are negotiating at the moment a protocol on investment. We have got the third draft this week, as a matter of fact. So we have had 2 iterations so far, having done the situation analysis, the capacity building, awareness creation, and then got down to actually negotiations. And the negotiators are having a third look at it this week. In my assessment, I think this is good progress. We can actually expect to have a final protocol ready for adoption this November, when the heads of state and government meet in an extraordinary summit on the AFCFTA. So why has there been a lot of noise, a lot of hype, a lot of positive, shall I say, noise, expectation about the investment in the region? Well, first of all, as we speak now, ever since the AFCFTA was announced, we have had a number of foreign direct investments coming into the continent as a strategic intervention, as a strategic move on the part of the companies to position themselves on the continent in order to reap the benefits of the African Continental Free Trade Area, the preferential treatment that's going to be available across the continent, all the way from South Africa, that's the automotive industry, all the way to Egypt and to Morocco. We've seen this phenomenon. Obviously, these companies are coming onto the continent because they expect to reap benefits. Returns on investments are highest actually on the continent compared to returns in other parts of the world. Then secondly, the protocol we are drafting is going to improve the business environment on the continent. This is good news for the investors, but it's also good news for investors that are coming onto the continent. But it's also good news for local investors or domestic investors. This ranges from obligations on investors, rights of investors, the right of governments to regulate, taking into account the need to protect the public and, of course, to protect the environment and the planet. So the protocol is going to be good news. Thirdly, regional value chains that actually link SMEs into big companies on the continent are going to be boosted or promoted. And again, we just have to look at the internet, read some literature, for instance, how we made it in Africa, to see how SMEs are beginning to plug into big companies. And on this note, Andrew has made this point, my good friend Andrew Mould, that we need to talk about SMEs, but equally need to talk about big companies as well, as they actually have a bigger share in intra-Africa trade or intra-regional trade, in fact, or global trade for that matter, compared to SMEs that we talk about all the time. The SMEs may be many, but in terms of the share of trade, big companies actually are drivers. So they need to be taken into account as well. So I can pause at this moment, having made these 3 points and observations, so that others can also come in.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for that, Andrew. I think this is a natural follow-on to Francis' comments. Do you want to say something along those lines?
Yes, good afternoon, colleagues. Pleasure to join you again. Let me just keep my opening comment very brief, but effectively, as Francis is saying, we know that global trade is very much linked with the activities of multinational corporations. The most standard figure you hear is as much as 80% of global trade is associated with the operations of multinational corporations, and around half of that is apparently intra-firm trade, so within the same company group. So I've just been a strong believer since the announcement of the Continental Free Trade Area that for us to see the kind of level of sudden growth of intra-regional trade that everybody's expecting, then it's going to be incumbent on countries to attract more cross-border investment. And now you may see some external actors also coming in to invest more heavily in the African continental, the larger continental market. But I think it's really crucial that there's a lot more cross-border investment within the continent. That's the way to build these regional value chains and to really make sure that the rate of growth of trade accelerates across the continent.
Thank you, Andrew. Now let's give the word to Ziad.
Yeah, thank you, Raj. First of all, good afternoon, and thank you for organizing this forum. Indeed, a very important question, and I would like to think of it from the perspective of what the AFCFTA has to offer for investors, mostly based in Africa, against non-African investors who are coming to look for opportunities for cross-border investment, because we've always had this conversation, right, about countries attracting foreign direct investments and then looking at ways where they compete against each other for some of these foreign direct investment flows, and then looking at the various monitors. So for me, I mean, my biggest ambition is to arrive at an opportunity where, as you rightfully said, along with Andrew, about building the regional value chains, which means that we establish an investment base that draws and procures and sources its goods and services from across the region, and then sells back its goods and services across the borders into a wider market. And so the opportunity here is the wider African market. And so we need to create this kind of opportunity. But to get there, I am trying to look at this matrix that starts from the national level, where you have some of the national laws, then you have a regional framework, and then you have a continental framework. AFCFTA is currently being negotiated. There was an aspiration called the PIAC, and so maybe AFCFTA can successfully build on what the PIAC was doing. But for us, the main thing is to offer value addition for investors to actually adopt the AFTA investment protocol, and that it will give a comparative advantage to African-based organizations and enterprises versus non-African-based ones. And that is where I think we have to think really well about how to create the value added for Africans who would choose to select the AFCFTA investment regime. That is how I'm looking at it at the moment. And one point maybe that made me ponder today when I was reading through, when I came across the news that Barclays have finally pulled out of Africa after selling their ABSA stake in South Africa. The bottom line is that today's world is in constant motion. The dynamics are constantly moving, and this puts the kinds of pressures on various countries to look at how to push themselves ahead of the pack. So how will AFCFTA convince the rest of the companies, the rest of the countries to negotiate collectively as one to the advantage of all? These are some of the thoughts that I have at the moment, and these are my hopes for the upcoming AFTA investment. Over to you, Raj.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think, Ziad, you bring up an important point that everyone is skirting around, and that is to say we are looking at incredible complexity of policy. We have national level policies, we have bilateral agreements, BITs, we have existing regional economic agreements, some of which are more redundant than others. I'm thinking about ECOWAS always when I think about that. But we have some that are functional, and then we want to have a continental set of policies, and then of course we have the WTO on top of everything else. So we have, it's not just a multi-layer cake, but these layers are interconnected, and to play devil's advocate, which is my role, I think here. Are we not seeing a situation whereby the average investor will just be in shock, in policy shock, in regulatory shock? All of these levels are coming in at the same time. How are they going to deal with this information? Is this not an overload of information? So let me pose this question to you, and Francis, I think, is the right man for this.
Right. Yes, I like it when you become the devil's advocate. So I remember last time at the end of the webinar, you were no longer the devil's advocate. You are now the ambassador of the AFCFTA, undertaking diplomatic agencies throughout the world for the AFCFTA. Right. So you touched on a very important issue, policy complexity. In fact, as I had pointed out earlier, we're supposed to have this protocol, which constitutes a single investment regime across the continent. Actually, the AFCFTA is about creating a single regime across the continent in all the areas that are covered by the AFCFTA: trading goods, trading services, competition policy, intellectual property, digital trade, as well as investment, of course. So you raise an important issue. Now, maybe there are just 2 or 3 things that can be said here. First of all, we have the example of South Africa. In 2015, South Africa enacted a law on investment, which actually dealt with all these issues you're raising. The issue of complexities, policy, regulatory complexities, including BITs, bilateral investment treaties, by simply saying that all investments will be governed by this act or by this law. And that is supposed to have settled the matter. Of course, there are challenges here and there, but that seems to have been welcomed immensely. For instance, I remember just after that law was passed, there was a huge meeting of UNCTAD in Nairobi, and this initiative or approach was warmly welcomed by all delegations that spoke, including UNCTAD itself. So at the national level, you can actually, just get a broad brush approach where you enact a national law, say, all right, we shall govern investment using this law, not BITs, not another instrument, but this law with regard to access to courts, rights of investors, rights of governments, obligations of investors, obligations of governments. Now, the second thing that can be said is actually the draft protocol, which is being negotiated, proposes to abolish intra-Africa BITs. All right. So that is supposed to be drastic, but it seems like the logical step to take if you really think that BITs pose some regulatory policy complexities, which are costly for investors. So that's the proposal on the table. However, what can be expected is that governments will have to look at the protocol when the negotiations are finalized, before, of course, signing it off, to see whether it is a superior regime to their BITs, whether it covers all the issues that BITs are meant to cover. And if it does, then they will agree to do away with the BITs. But if they think that the AFCFTA protocol doesn't address all the issues that BITs address, there could be some desire to keep some of those BITs. So let us wait until we cross the bridge. Now, regarding regional economic communities, the arrangement or the proposal is that the AFCFTA would subsume the REC instruments on investments. That is, the AFCFTA protocol would be superior. If there's any inconsistency between the AFCFTA protocol and the regimes of the regional economic communities, then the AFCFTA protocol takes precedence, and the regimes of the RECs, to the extent of the inconsistency, do not apply or cease to apply. Now, the reason this approach has to be taken or makes sense is that regional economic communities have advanced in some areas. Take the East African community, for instance. It's a common market going onto a monetary union. And they have got actually quite ambitious goals, go on all the way to a federation. Now, those higher levels of integration could have implications for investment. For instance, when it comes to sectoral cooperation in the areas of agriculture, mining, for instance, because industrialization as well. So that's why it's important to preserve those deeper levels of cooperation or harmonization. So that's why, though you may wish to shut down the RECs, there is merit in keeping them because they have attained deeper levels, so better levels of harmonization that the AFCFTA protocol may yet be still to attain. So I can leave it at that and maybe turn it back to you again.
Andy, do you want to add something to that?
No, I mean, I think what Francis is proposing makes a lot of sense, to build on the REC framework on the one hand, and also learn also from this South African experience of, streamlining some of these investment laws, because effectively it is extremely complicated with so many bilateral FDI treaties in force on the continent. So the proposal is a good one. Yeah.
So, but I mean, what I'm struggling with really, and is that countries may have diverging interests sometimes, especially, and we can see this from the example of Europe, that especially in the early days of the single market, there was quite a considerable amount of tension because state objectives contradict the larger unit, the EU objectives. And there was some kickback, some pushback from the nation states, say member states, saying, no, we want our competition policy supersedes yours. Our voters are not the same people, because the elections are a local thing. Elections are a country-specific thing. So how do you see this coming up? Would you really see that the states will cede control over their policy tools?
Yes, I mean, the difference really with the European Union, certainly the single market program, was that the multinationals were the ones that were very much asking for the SMP. They were lobbying in the mid-80s for the creation of a single market. So that's rather different, I think, because the AFCFTA has more been an intergovernmental agreement through member states of the African Union. And it hasn't been so much up till now, the business community being in the driving seat. Now, will member states be prepared to sacrifice a little bit of sovereignty in terms of determining their policies for the sake of greater coherence at the continental level? You would certainly hope so, because the current architecture possibly doesn't make much sense, I think. There needs to be a degree of standardization of approach, or otherwise you will get what we tend to call a race to the bottom, won't we, where countries will be trying to outbid each other in terms of attracting mobile investment. So that wouldn't be a very healthy outcome. So there's a lot. We're all waiting on the sidelines here actually to see what the final agreement is going to look like. But my belief is, firstly, that a degree of a standard approach is required across the continent in the first place. And secondly, there need to be provisions, which I think Ziad was hinting at as well, of preference for intra-African investors. Some extent where there is an advantage given to African firms investing on the African continent vis-a-vis third-party firms investing. Now, that doesn't mean keeping those third-party firms out, of course. They can play a very important role in economic integration as well. But I do believe that it's important that we provide the right incentives for greater cross-border investment within the continent.
So I see what you're saying, but there's always a challenge making this fit in with obligations within the WTO, and the kind of preferential access, etc., has always been an issue. But I do see your point. Ziad, do you want to jump in on this?
I do. Thank you for bringing me in. There are 2 points actually that I wanted to make, but first I have to respond to comment on something that Andy referred to with regard to prior consultation, because we shouldn't be waiting for the AFTA investment law to come out before we decide that we're going to buy into, because that has a real danger of not having enough buy-in on the local ground and people not accepting it. And then what do? Are you going to come to businesses in local communities and tell them, well, this is the new law, let's all amend our laws to that? And in all cases, the next question is, would states be as willing to align their current national investment laws to perfectly harmonize?
I think we may have a technical, yes, we may have a technical problem here. Ziad.
Sorry about that. I think I broke up, right?
Yes, you did.
So very quickly, in summary, I have an issue with the prior consultation. We need to have prior consultation as a business community. Otherwise, we'll get to a situation where the AFTA investment laws might not be 100% agreed to on the local level. And I also have my doubts whether states will actually align their national investment laws to those of the AFTA investment laws, even if they openly agree. So, for example, Nigeria has the NIPC Act, Ghana has the GIC Act of 865. Ghana is currently reviewing the Ghana Investment Promotion Law, but they are currently holding. The other point is when you have to do something that has to do with the regional economic communities, when you have several economic communities, and you have to decide which of these 2 regional economic communities supersedes over the other. Now, I do hear that there's a bit of, how to say, I like Francis' idea that the AFCFTA is assumed to take precedence over all regional and national laws, but I seriously doubt whether this can be a non-conflicting item on many countries. So what if Nigeria decide that they don't want the AFTA investment protocol to supersede their own NIPC, for example? So these are some of the issues that I have concern with.
Excellent.
And that needs to be resolved on more holistically in order to manage to drive forward.
Yeah, I mean, there is always this question of who decides the strategic objectives, and this is actually an important one. Will we think in terms of FDI policy and industrial policy at a continental level? This is for me one of the difficult things to imagine, because despite the single market and everything else, there still remains quite a difference between the objectives, given the comparative advantage of different nation states within the EU, and of course the even larger gap in comparative advantage across the continent. Does it make sense to have a continent-wide strategic set of objectives? Andrew, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I mean, I was just thinking what we could learn from the European experience in this sense, because on the one hand, my understanding is at least, investment promotion agencies in individual countries do have the freedom still to tailor make their offers to external investors from outside the European Union as they wish. But at the same time, there's a degree of leveling up, let's say, across the continent. And also there is, of course, the right for investors from any single member state to invest in another member state and get completely equal treatment to any national investor. So there's no impediments at all about cross-border investment within the single market. And I mean, I guess that's what the continent needs to be striving for. And then countries would perhaps have individual packages to be able to attract investors from third-party countries.
Francis, do you want to add a comment here?
Yes, I agree with what Andrew has just said there. In fact, core obligations of the proposed AFCFTA investment protocol include non-discrimination, both the most favored nation as well as national treatment. Right, so this would level the playing field and allow cross-border investments to seamlessly flow. I wanted to touch on a few issues which colleagues have raised, including Zia. On sovereignty, I think there's a recognition that we need some supranational institutions. We need at least these kinds of institutions around. The only sensitivity is if you package it as a losing sovereignty. If you go to a government and say, please, can you lose some of your sovereignty? They probably will not respond positively. But if you package it as sharing of sovereignty, as pooling of sovereignty in order to be stronger in terms of either of jointly acting together within the intergovernmental institutions, probably they would be more receptive. I think even the European Union has been talking about pooling of sovereignty. So it's a matter of how you address it, but probably you would come to the same thing. Probably you wouldn't come to the powers of the EC, which has got exclusive competence in negotiating trade-related matters on behalf of the EU. Probably you wouldn't get that far. Probably in Africa, you wouldn't have a secretariat that has such powers, but you could have in Africa an African Investment Authority, just like you have regional investment authorities or regional competition authorities. We can get that far if we strive. So if we package it as sharing of sovereignty. Then secondly, I wanted to touch on these important points Ziad has made, the need for consultations, the need for an inclusive process. So this is paramount. The design of the protocol has to be based on a bottom-up approach, a consultative approach. If we don't have input from stakeholders, from users, that protocol probably will be irrelevant to their needs or requirements. It might not address their core issues. So this is extremely important. And that's why, as this protocol is being negotiated, the national processes for developing national positions or REC processes for developing REC positions, for instance, ESC consultations, ECOWAS consultations, need to be inclusive. All stakeholders need to be on board, bringing together the government or the public sector, the private sector, not just big industry, but SMEs, civil society, activists as well, and academia, of course, universities, think tanks, all influencers, so that you can come up with coherent positions. Even within government, you need all the relevant departments, not just the Ministry of Trade, but the investment authorities as well, and other actors, other regulatory authorities, sectoral regulatory authorities need to be on board as well. Then the issue of implementation. Implementation has been a problem in Africa. There's no denying that. But that the political will is extremely important. We need political will and leadership. So far, political will around the AFCFTA has been high, actually consistently high. So we hope that that momentum can be maintained. But in addition to the political will, even the consultative process should get us into that space where we have policy coherence or policy clarity. We avoid policy ambiguity, and we also avoid policy conflicts. We have policy coherence. There's a good friend of ours called Professor Landry Senior, we keep mentioning him, who has come up with this framework, very simple framework. That's one of the reasons implementation has been a problem in Africa is because of policy conflicts arising from the way the instruments are designed, and lack of policy clarity or policy ambiguity. So we have high policy conflicts and then high policy ambiguity. In other words, both the policy community, the systemic communities have not done their work well, have not completed their work. Then implementation will be a problem. On the other hand, if you have policy clarity and then you have less policy conflicts, then implementation will be good. So this starts from the preparatory process, from the design process. And I think Ziad makes a very important point that we need to watch this issue of implementation carefully. But also we need, as the protocol is being negotiated, and when it's being implemented, to always promote awareness, to always build capacity in government, in the private sector as well. And also to have mechanisms for settlement of disputes so that there is confidence in the system, so that people know that their rights will be enforced if they are breached. So I thought those were two very important points that Ziad raised, which I fully agree with. But now, Rajneesh, turning to you, Raj, you raised the issue of the WTO. I think that you have raised it twice now. I'm sorry, the first time I didn't touch on it. The World Trade Organization doesn't have an agreement on investment as such. However, the General Agreement on Trade in Services touches on investment. But there, thank God, this is what many of us in the developing world say, there are no trims, no restrictions on what are called trade-related investment measures. Yeah. So under the General Agreement on Trade in Services, meaning in the services sectors, the 12 of them, member states can actually impose restrictions. It's a positive approach. You decide which sectors to open up and on what terms. So under the AFCFTA protocol, we can actually do that. So there will be no conflict whatsoever between the protocol and the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade in Services, that extent. Now, regarding the agreement on trade-related investment measure streams, developing countries still enjoy this policy space, this flexibility to deviate from what that agreement says. But basically, that agreement has got the non-discrimination principle, of course, at the global level, but at the regional level, we can have some preferential treatment and therefore deviate from it. However, things like performance indicators, these seem to still be required on the basis of development experience and practice, whether you're looking at China or even in European countries that's industrialized later or developed later, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and so on and so forth. So you need such interventions to help these countries grow. Now, if you are talking about sectoral agreements like the teletechnology agreement, we can talk about that, but it's not a multilateral agreement as such. So in conclusion then on the WTO, I don't think there is necessarily a conflict between the AFCFTA protocol on investment, or what it will be, and the WTO agreement. So I think the negotiators are careful to make sure that there is no conflict or such conflicts are avoided. In any case, they are simply focused on development using the policy space that's available under the WTO instruments for development, or focusing on areas not covered by the WTO, which then we move into and try to be creative about in developing a positive, user-friendly, supportive environment, facilitative environment for cross-border investment on the continent. So that's what I wanted to say to allay your fears. Don't fear the WTO. Many of our negotiators are seasoned, WTO negotiators. They have been there for years. There have been ambassadors there at the WTO representing their countries. So they are aware of their WTO obligations. They will not breach them.
Well,
I think,
yeah, thank you, Francis. Now, the fact that number of directions the conversation can go multiplying as with every sentence. And we have now a lot of people asking questions on the chat and also the Q&A. But the one I want to talk about services, because I think we talk about goods and we talk about manufacturers as well. Is often the industrialization question comes up, of course, Africa has a lot of resource-intensive exports as well. But we need to talk about services. But before I go to services, one of the things that is the issue of enforcement. And this connects to a couple of comments that we have in the chat about who's going to do the enforcing. Is it going to be done at a national level? Are we going to now have a AFCTA office? Aloysius mentions this. Upenu brings up the issue of stakeholder engagement. To what extent how are we going to enforce? Are laws at the AU level, to what extent are they enforceable at the national level? So maybe let's talk about enforcement. I think Ziad brought this up in our earlier conversations. So let's start with Ziad on this.
Indeed, enforcement has always been a weakness, as all of my colleagues have previously said, either directly or indirectly. And I wonder whether the Board of Dispute Resolution, which is also part of the main components of the AFCFTA, will also have the capacity to enforce the implementation, given that nations will, as they usually do within reg disputes or inter-reg disputes, they will always bring up the issue of sovereignty. And this comes back to the question about how much sovereignty are we relinquishing. And sometimes I ask myself whether the issue is being approached in the right way. Is it that there is an opportunity cost for the implementation and the enforcement of regional laws? Because we always assume that these laws, which are regional by nature, are supposed to add value to whoever is using them, as if it is self-evident. Sometimes the laws that integrate nations and their laws and regulations do not necessarily, connect by themselves. You need to force them to stay connected. Otherwise, the moment you stop forcing them together, they will just disintegrate. And I think we have to look at the incentives, not just at sanctions and the resolutions and enforcement. Because once you create a system of incentives that allows nations and users across Africa to use these laws to their advantage, that will make them more likely and willing to enforce themselves the implementation of these laws, whether the users or the takers of these policies. I think it's worth thinking about it from this direction.
Absolutely. That's right. There's a comment by Rafia Akram, who says facilitation is going to be key. We need to work on positive image of African investors and the importance of small and medium enterprise, cross-border trade and presence. How do we get to this point? This is in the Q&A. But I think that really the issue here is the enforcement, implementation. There's always that danger that you have regulation, but the regulators have no teeth for various reasons. And we've seen that in a number of instances where, in fact, even in China, one sees this, that, for instance, IPR policies are there, all the regulations are there, all the legal legislation is there, but the enforcement is incomplete. Sometimes enforcement is incomplete because the state doesn't have the resources to enforce, as in Bangladesh, for instance. I recently discovered the problem is not that they don't have the legislation, but there's only one lawyer who has the knowledge of international IP, and therefore there is a queue of people waiting to answer these questions. But yeah, I think this is going to be really one of the challenges. And Bernadetta asks, will there be a regional FDI policy, or will individual countries enact their own policies? Perhaps Andrew can come in on this point.
Well, I was actually going to suggest we invite Francis to just say something a little bit about the COMESA Competition Authority, because actually they've already been quite active in cases of mergers and acquisitions, for example. I seem to recall it was about 23 cases they'd adjudicated over. But Francis, being the former DG of Trade at COMESA, would be able to give us much more informed view on that. I think those are good precedents, those kind of regional experiences in competition regulation and rules. But Francis, perhaps.
Francis, yes, please.
Right. Thank you so much, Raj and Andrew. Yeah, so Andrew, you're perfectly correct. Actually, the example of the COMESA Competition Commission is the answer to those skeptics who think that Africa cannot have supranational institutions. So the COMESA Competition Authority has been around since the year 2013. It has done a large number of cases, mergers and acquisitions, consumer protection, and so on and so forth. It has got a track record of success. It has been embraced by the governments, including the national competition authorities. They have all embraced it. There has been no conflict whatsoever between the national competition authorities and the COMESA Competition Commission. And it's not, COMESA also has the Regional Investment Agency, which is based in Cairo, which works actually quite well as an institution that assists to facilitate investment. And it's not only COMESA, you look at the East African community. It also has supranational institutions. It has a parliament, which passes laws which are directly applicable and binding on partner states, and which take precedence over national laws, and which actually can confer rights directly on individuals as natural persons or on companies, which can be enforced in the through the East African Court of Justice, which has also been very active over the years and has had a large number of cases found actually against governments, and governments have had to bring their measures in line with the East African community instruments. So we have got quite a number of case studies of supranational institutions and how this can work on the continent, which we can build on as we formulate continental instruments on competition and on investment. So I wanted to really confirm and endorse what Andrew has just said. Now, secondly, there's a comment that facilitation is key by Rafia. I fully agree with that. And on this, at this point, maybe we can point out that there are good practices around the continent on how facilitation is being done, investment facilitation, whether you're looking at Rwanda or Botswana or South Africa, actually across the continent. So from investment protection, which continues to happen, we've now scaled up to investment facilitation. I think one of the interesting examples is, for instance, the idea of aftercare service for investors. It sounds, like a service, like a repair shop. I would say that's what it is. It's called aftercare services, meaning that after an investor is into the country, you don't abandon them. You continue to facilitate them, attend to their issues that they may raise. In some countries, they are called investment clinics. Yes. In addition, of course, to having a one-stop shop for all investment issues, including licenses, that's pre-entry and entry issues. So we have got good practice around the continent on how to facilitate investment, which we are building on. Now, there was also a comment, Raj, if you allow me, about requirements, infrastructure requirements, airports, seaports, telecommunication, roads. That's what Rajiv has posted. You are spot on. These are required. In fact, the Economic Commission for Africa has done a report recently, which is on the internet, on the transport requirements for the AFCFTA. And it puts the bill at $411 billion over the next 10 years. This is what we need to invest in order to facilitate investment from the transportation, logistics, infrastructure perspective. You can see this as a cost, but it's also an investment opportunity. So in other words, what we're saying is that there's an investment opportunity here worth $411 billion. Yes, there are issues there are challenges we need to deal with, all these challenges, but we can also look at them as opportunities that investors can follow. Then, interestingly, Raj, like yourself, the devil's advocate, we have a skeptic. Mitch, am I allowed to call you a skeptic? There's in the chat, somebody called a good friend called Mitch. I'm saying good because he's like you, Raj, who says, will this actually happen? Can this actually happen? You say, what's the probability? Now, we have had skepticism around the AFCFTA for years, going back to 2010 to 2012, when this idea was broached. Everybody was saying, both on the continent and outside the continent, that there is no way Africa can have an African continental free trade area, or the continental free trade area at that time, as it was being called at that time. It is impossible. You cannot negotiate it. But it was negotiated in a record time of just under 2.5 years, right? So, shall I say, to the dismay of skeptics and to the delight of all optimists. So we did it. And now people said, will there ever be a secretariat? Well, we have a secretariat which is up and running. We now have 105 people working here at the secretariat, right? They were saying, will it ever be implemented? Well, you look around, we have got 42 ratifications. We have got national coordination offices that have been established in countries around the continent. We have got AFCFTA national implementation strategies, 42 of them that have been finalized around the continent. Everything is on track, right? It's just utilization which needs now to kick into high gear, actual trading to happen, but everything is in place. So, Mitch, yes, we will do it. Just watch this space, is what I can say to you. Will AU lead the AFCFTA? No. The AFCFTA is an organ of the African Union, but it's independent, it's autonomous. It has got its own legal personality and status. That's why it has a secretariat and a secretary general. So the AFCFTA forms one of the organs of the African Union. However, it has its own secretariat, which oversees the AFCFTA agreement. Will the AFCFTA have a head office on investment? The secretariat will continue to backstop all investment negotiations as well as investment implementation, undertake advocacy. But there can be an Africa Investment Agency or authority apart from the secretariat. That's a matter for negotiation. We shall see what comes of the negotiations. Enforcement is extremely important, so that's why one of the key areas being negotiated is enforcement. Shall we use the general AFCFTA dispute settlement system, which is state to state, or should we introduce a system for investor to state disputes? This is being negotiated, and I'm sure we shall get a good outcome out of it. But enforcement is important. Everybody has underlined it. Ziada has underlined it. Andrew has underlined it. Raj, you have underlined it. And in the chat box, it's also highlighted as key. If you have an instrument you can't enforce, you don't have an instrument. Or if you purport to have an instrument which you can't enforce, it's practically useless. It may confer rights, but those rights are not rights to the extent that they are not enforced. So it's key that we have an enforceable AFCFTA protocol on enforcement. And I think this is a priority. Back to you, Raj.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Francis, you're a one-man band of information. Everything we need to know, we just have to knock on your door. But I think we should let Andy does have some ideas of his own, and he may even disagree with you. Let's see. Andrew, floor is yours.
No, I wasn't going to disagree. I was just going to take the conversation on a little bit of a different tack, because we haven't really talked about the volumes of FDI to the continent and what the potential of the agreement is in terms of boosting FDI. You hinted at it, Rajneesh, in your opening remark. The Bloomstrong paper on regional integration and its impact talked very much about a 25% increase in FDI due to regional integration on the continent, in continental agreements. Sorry. Now, there's been another more recent study by the World Bank, Roberto Echandi and colleagues, where they did some simulation work on how much extra additional FDI we could expect from the agreement. And that found that the boost was really very large, actually. They did two different scenarios on I think it was a broad integration scenario. It was 109% increase in FDI to the continent. And under a deep integration scenario, which is basically what the Continental Agreement is a deep integration agreement, they find I think it was 159% increase in FDI. So these are really big figures. You know, there are quite some large expectations around the agreement. Now, we could inform ourselves a little bit about the European experience because the studies at the time tended to show at the implementation of the SMP that there was an initial boost in FDI, and that responds, you know, to the creation of the larger borderless market. But that subsequently declined somewhat after the agreement, and then actually the European Union went back to its trend in terms of its percentage share of global FDI. So it didn't look like the positive impact by the creation of a large market lasted indefinitely. It was more of a, you know, one-off effect. So those were just some observations I thought we might like to make about, you know, how do we think investors are going to react? And I guess another question to interrogate, Rajneesh, was what you suggested about the motivations behind investment will change in a larger continental market. So some markets seeking investments which were initially made under, you know, higher levels of protection may lose their rationale. You know, companies may decide to relocate in locations where they have, you know, more competitive advantage and serve the continental market from there. But it should increase the attractiveness of efficiency-seeking investments, both from outside and within the continent, and that should give a boost to FDI. And also market-seeking investments which wouldn't have arrived earlier because companies considered the individual markets too small, but find the regional and continental market much more attractive. I was looking at some figures of US FDI and how US multinationals treat the continental market. And that was really quite interesting because you could see in Europe, the multinationals based in Europe from the United States, they sell about 80% of their exports to third countries within the regional bloc. But they had the same figures broken down for Africa, and it was only 17%. So where the United States has affiliates on the African continent, only 17% of those exports are then exported to third-party countries within the continent. So that is a measure, isn't it, of the level of lack of integration, perhaps, of the African market. Now, I would suspect that those figures are a little bit distorted by the fact that, you know, more than 50% of the investment stock of US firms is actually in minerals. So that's why the intra-regional figure is so low, but it's still an interesting take. It would be great to have those figures only for manufacturing firms or services firms, for example, and see how much of their sales are already towards the continental market.
Good, thank you. Thank you for those very interesting points. I think, you know, one of the things that will be, and I think someone in the chat, I think, had brought this up. I think Rajib Sanyal mentions this. You know, of course, there will be a need for considerable investment in infrastructure, and you know, because if we're going to take full advantage of being a single market, there will need to be much better infrastructure. You know, it's one of my ever long-standing complaints is getting from one part of the continent to the other. Requires you to fly through Paris or London, and that is something. Or nowadays in Casablanca is also an option, but nonetheless, getting from Lagos to Nairobi is something of a challenge. So, of course, for goods and services to move, for goods especially to move around, will require quite some kind of a standardized approach to building effective infrastructure and maintaining it, because in fact, a number of times we see these things built, but not properly maintained. Connecting the railway systems together, indeed connecting the roads would be a challenge. So I think these are issues that are important. Otherwise, we were going to see during the early part of European integration, the conversation headed towards the discussion of hollowing out. Those of us in the room old enough to remember this, this was one of the great fears, that there would be this hollowing out, that investment would leave Southern Europe or vice versa and go to Northern Europe or vice versa. The same conversation happened, of course, in America with NAFTA. And I remember Ross Perot saying there will be this whooshing sound or something like that, where everything would flow out of the United States and go to Mexico. Of course, these things didn't happen, but nonetheless, there are going to be people who bring up this conversation about hollowing out.
Rajneesh, if I may say on that point, I mean, it is a very important stylized fact that around 60 to 70% of all intra-African FDI stock is held by South African firms. So they are enormously dominant in terms of the share of the total. And it will be interesting to see how the Continental Agreement works out in terms of, conferring advantages perhaps to countries which have not been investing so much. I don't know if I mentioned, but in terms of the continent's ability to attract FDI, it has been marginalized from the global economy in a similar way to trade. So I was checking the figures, and we all know the very famous, the Africa accounts for about 2-3% of global trade. The figure is, strikingly similar for FDI, actually. It's around 2-3%. And if you look at outward FDI, of course, the continent's share of global outward FDI is less than 1%. So it's very marginalized in that sense. But I think what particularly interests me from a regional perspective is, how the AFCFTA is going to change the dynamics of those investment flows, and will South Africa retain its dominance in terms of the main intra-regional investor, or will investors pick up from elsewhere on the continent? So I think it was Ziad was talking about Morocco and Egypt earlier, for example. OCP from Morocco investing in fertilizer plants in Ethiopia and Rwanda, for example. There's a number of companies, like Dangote in cement sector as well, across the continent. So it'll be interesting how that plays out.
This is true. The conversation, of course, about services. South Africa, for instance, dominates the insurance industry across Africa now, the largest player in many cases, and even American and European multinational service companies use South Africa as the regional headquarters. So there is this tendency for South Africa, in a way, I think similar to the way Germany sort of is the Germany, well, in it gets to Europe, Germany, France, and the UK used to act as the dominant actors within the EU. There is a similar, there should be, probably will be a similar tendency for South Africa to be the dominant actor, or indeed as Brazil is within Mercosur and so forth. So we're going to see some of that, I suspect, and there will be displacement, and there will be some. If countries don't invest enough in building up their location advantages, we are going to see investment displacement and hollowing out. I think that's for sure. It is incumbent on nation states to build up their education systems, provide the right kind of people, and create the environment, the milieu that encourages people to feel comfortable about making investment. As you yourself, I think, note somewhere else, so much of the trade and investment is in the shadow economy, in the informal sector. That's also something that we haven't really, that we need to think about, because there is, there's a fair amount of investment that is associated with perhaps not necessarily in dollar terms, but in terms of number of investments. There's quite a lot of investment that takes place, let's say indirectly, through shells of different kinds, or through family-owned businesses.
Well, actually, Rajneesh, on that particular point, I can see Ziad wants to come in on this discussion, but one thing that distorts the Continental figures enormously are the Mauritian figures, actually. So if we would go back to that World Bank report that was being recently released that I mentioned, they estimate that the FDI stock for the continent is $800 billion US. But the minute that you strip out the FDI that has been round tripped through Mauritius, you get down to 500 billion. So it makes a big difference. And that's clearly the case in Eastern Africa, where you see Mauritius as the leading investor in countries like Rwanda and Uganda, very high on the list in Kenya as well. And it's just often third-party countries investing in the continental market, but using that for reducing their tax liabilities.
Actually, I wanted to come in with regards to the discussion on financing inter-African connectivity. And I wanted to stop on two very important but frustrating impediments to enhancing the African connectivity. One has to do with the maritime connectivity, and one has a direct impact on air connectivity. And we always complain about the exorbitant costs of inter-African flights. You end up paying anywhere between $700 to $1,000 for going through different countries. Even if you go straight from point X to point Y within Africa, you still end up with a lot. And you assume that this is the cost of transportation, but that is not the case. Because most of the time, airports across Africa charge anywhere between $100 and $250 per airport. And you combine that together and you end up with a figure, an additional cost, in addition to the actual travel cost, of anywhere between $200 and $500. And this is actually because of the airports who are regulated by the civil aviation authorities on a national level. So all of the various countries have a vested interest in slapping that $100 or $200 or $250 per airport. And that is how come they ended up in the far-flung ends of Africa in building such incredible airports on their own finances. So civil aviation authorities in Mali, in Niger, in Burkina, in Togo, everywhere else, I'm not talking about the larger countries, they end up building some fantastic airports. And that's not with borrowed money, that's with money. So if you want to insist on inflating the cost of air connectivity that much, then there's really no need for someone to come from outside and to try to distort the markets any further, because you're doing it successfully on a national level. That's one thread. The other thread has to do with the maritime connectivity, simply because one of the reasons you don't have shipping across Africa and something like cabotage, as we call it, or short sea shipping, more commonly referred to, is that most of the ports, the seaports across Africa, would charge you port dues. That is once you call your ship to their ports, they would charge you a rate equivalent, let's say, for a vessel that is carrying 1,000 containers. So any vessel that is less than 1,000 containers and calls, let's say, at the port of Tema, they will end up paying the same amount as a vessel that has 1,000 containers. And what do you think that does with the short sea connectivity? There's absolutely no motivation or incentive for investing into the African shipping industry, simply because the ports are not incentivized to create a structure that allows investors to come into this particular market and explore some of the ventures. And so we seem to be intentionally shooting ourselves in the foot by creating some national regulations that reduce the competitiveness of our investment, of our national investment. And I'm really hoping that the AFCFTA investment protocol will look at how it will create this kind of incentive to remove some of these. We can consider them non-tariff barriers, but they're not really non-tariff. They are tariff barriers because they are set by the states. And states have sovereignty over charging fees and levies. So how can we reduce some of these fees and levies in a way that opens up the various countries to investment across the border, especially for Africans? two things that kept going through my mind when we're talking about Africa connectivity.
Thank you. That was a very useful illumination of some of the problems. Indeed, this is one of the challenges in general. I mean, I've been working on FDI for 30 issues relating to FDI and development for 30 years, and this is always, the problem of raising the transaction cost so high that it acts as a deterrent to investments. That is to say, only the largest investors who are able to get extraordinary profits can afford to pay these usurious charges, so therefore kind of eliminating the small and medium enterprises from actually growing, because they have to pay as much as the big firm, as a large firm.
Like a market barrier, right?
Yes, it is a barrier, and it's surprisingly, this is what this ends leading to is an underdeveloped SME sector and a very strong large firm sector. And we see this having happened in India. The data, you can see this kind of thing, that they have a very large tail of small and medium enterprises struggling to get beyond 25 people, going beyond micro size. And then you have those very large firms at the other end. And this is actually something that we're in danger of having in Africa as well. We have this kind of tendency to raise the transaction costs unduly. The burden of on the smaller firm as a percentage of their revenues is quite considerable.
Rajneesh, I think I would dispute that as a risk for the Africa continent to some extent, actually, partly because the large firms are conspicuous by their absence quite often. If you look at it on global scale, if you compare it, to the global rankings of the largest companies, the African companies are not present. The only ones that do tend to appear in some of those lists are South African, a handful of South African companies. But even then, and if you look at regions, the sub-region like where I work in Eastern Africa, you will see that the average size of firms is really very small. So I'm not quite sure that's the danger. And I seem to remember reading Banjuri and Duflo as well, talking about the structure, even in India, has been rather different, actually. They were saying that a lot of the programs in support of SMEs hadn't been effective, and that the large companies had struggled in India because of certain rules and regulations by the state as well. So it's not quite my reading of the literature.
Okay. Well, you know this stuff much better than I do, Andy. You're on the ground in Africa. Nowadays I'm more of a conceptual person, reading other people's work.
Yeah, Rajneesh, one thing I didn't say, actually, I mean, the one thing that comes through in a lot of studies is the high degree of profitability of activities on the continent. Now, you'll see that reported in US FDI on the continent. It's around double their global average returns on the African continent, even though the mineral sector over the last 5-6 years hasn't done so well. So it's not purely down to that. If you look at, I was just reading, for example, Heineken and SAB Miller, their reported profits are about 50% higher than they have elsewhere in the world. So there's a lot of lucrative opportunities for investment on the continent. And you would hope by more investment, there would be more competition, and that would put gradual downward pressure on prices. The one sector which seems to be a bit immune from those laws of competition seems to be the Pan-African business banking sector, where there has been a lot of cross-border investment, and yet interest rates remain stubbornly high across the continent. And that is the thing that really squeezes, the small and medium-sized enterprises, the inability to access capital at affordable prices. And there we see, cross-border investment in itself doesn't necessarily produce the right desired outcomes without the necessarily regulatory frameworks often.
I think this is, thank you for taking us in this direction, Andy. I was going to try and move towards the issue of services, and banking is the perfect segue into that. I mean, I think that services, most of sub-Saharan Africa has the structure of a post-industrial economy. That is to say, the manufacturers has shrunk to quite a small size, whereas services has become the bulk of the economy. So really, I mean, opening up trade in services is an investment in services is perhaps even more important than manufacturing to some extent. That's my thought on the subject. Do you want to? What's your thinking in this regard?
So the question was going to.
Well, I want to start with you and then go to Ziad.
Well, I mean, I would definitely agree that there's a lot of lucrative business opportunities in greater cross-border investment in services. The problem is service sector liberalization is always a little bit more challenging than there is in the goods sector because of the intangible nature of a lot of the products which are being sold. So going back again to the European experience, they've had a lot more problems in service trade liberalization than compared with merchandise goods, where that was quickly achieved, actually, the merchandise good liberalization. So yes, I think there's a lot of opportunities on the continent, in the region. Kenyan companies, for example, in the tourism sector are very active. They're hotel chains, for example. South African supermarket chains have investment in West Africa, in Central Eastern Africa. All those things are positive developments, I think. So I would agree that the services side should not be neglected at all.
I was thinking about a scenario where an investor is set up in one country and then decides to consider whether he can relocate to another country using another investment regime. And I had this case with a group that is based in Burkina, producing candies. And they were considering relocating to Ghana because it makes more sense from their perspective to get closer to the source of the raw material. And then you start distributing your finished products, not just into Burkina Faso, but into the rest of West Africa. And so they went through the motions, going to the Investment Promotion Agency, the Free Zones Boards, the regulatory authorities and others. And then the last stumbling block was the fact that they realized at the end of the day that the authorities in Burkina Faso might not decide to allow the importation of a West African product under the ECOWAS protocol, simply because the regional investment protocol which Burkina Faso uses is the UM1 one. So Burkina Faso apparently has the option to choose between the regional investment protocols that are there, and then they will enforce the one that is more suitable to the state itself, to the detriment of whoever wants to relocate outside. And this brings us back to the question when Dr. Manjeni was talking about the AFCFTA investment protocols superseding over the regional or the national laws. I still wonder about the feasibility of this one, because when push comes to shove, the commitment of the state will be finalized after the investment will begin to be implemented. And that will be too late to assess already. So we need to look in advance and to get some kind of a preliminary commitment from the various states which are not only party states to the AFCFTA, but the other African states which eventually will become signatories and party members of the AFCFTA, so that they will commit vocally, or let's say clearly, to adopting the laws of the AFCFTA as superseding their own national laws and regional laws. And that is something I haven't heard yet. I might not have up-to-date information. It might have happened before, but it might be in the fine print somewhere, and someone will come up later on and complain about a fine print which we didn't see at the time. So what do we do today? Because we want to review that with retrospect. So what do we do? How do we move forward? These are the kinds of questions that I'm thinking about at the moment.
I think we're really, there's so many issues here. I mean, that I really want to bring up, but we're also running out of time as far as I can tell. Maybe I'm mistaken. I hope I'm mistaken. But my clock, I know that you can't blame mechanical clocks for not working anymore. In the old days, you could always do that, but alas, technology has moved on since my youth. And I want to, I'm going to just kind of give everyone a minute to close up. So what I think is worth talking about is standardizing investment policies, but then we have the problem of deciding incentives and subsidies, which happen at a national level, cannot be done at a supranational level, at least not as the frameworks currently exist. And I think we want to talk about GATS, but I think we're going to run out of time for both of these things. Lastly, one of the issues, of course, is leadership, because it's important that the biggest countries dominate this in a way that they make sure they push it home, rather than end up being stuck because of one country holding up the mechanism, or having its own internal problems that limits its access. So, but okay, let us do this. I think we should close, if I'm not mistaken, in a couple of minutes' time. Let me start off by giving everybody a minute to make any closing points they want. And this topic is so interesting, I think we're going to have to come back to it in a few months' time. But let's start with Francis. Some closing remarks, Francis.
Right. Thank you, Raj. Now, I wanted to make maybe 3 observations in closing. The first one is, shall I take Andrew's words, as somebody said in the chat, getting the narrative right. He has actually published this seminal piece, which tries to show the significance of intra-Africa trade. Everybody says it is 18% or 17%, but he argues very persuasively that it's much higher, maybe anything up to 28.4%, or in fact 42% for landlocked countries. So we always need to try to get the narrative right, and that equally applies also to investment. So that's the first point I wanted to make. That means, in practical terms, that we don't get an isolated incident and generalize it. On the contrary, it would be better to look at what's the general picture, then deal with the exceptions or the outliers, rather than the other way around, using the exceptions as the general picture to portray what you purports to be the general picture. I think that would be misleading. It doesn't do us justice as Africa, and in fact as the world. Secondly, second point I'd like to make is that you don't need a perfect regime in order to begin. You don't need to say, all right, there are no problems now, we can now begin to develop an AFCFTA protocol. No. On the contrary, if there are problems, put them on the table, so that as the AFCFTA protocol on investments being developed, those problems can be addressed. So I think we shouldn't say that, oh, because there are problems, this will not work or will never happen. On the contrary, let us please put those issues on the table through platforms like this one, through direct contact with the negotiators at the national level, or even directly with the Secretariat, so that these issues can be addressed. And now, in this regard, what I want to give as examples are the following. If you look at trading goods, we have got regional FTAs, which we have had for a very long time. The Commerce FTA has been there, Free Trade Area has been there since the year 2000. It doesn't mean that there are no non-tariff barriers, for instance. Actually, the AFCFTA helps you to discover what these non-tariff barriers are, because they will be measures that are in breach of the AFCFTA or the FTA which are put in place. So then the process of implementing the FTA, or in this case, the investment protocol, will bring out all the problems that need to be continuously addressed, just like we continue to battle non-tariff barriers. So for instance, all the things that Ziad was raising, these are the sort of things that we shall continuously work on as the AFCFTA protocol is being implemented and is being utilized. But even now, as we speak, they can be put on the table for negotiation, whether it's arbitrary charges or it's high charges or charges that don't make business sense, right? Or sectoral, restrictions, whether it's in the area of energy, transport, communication, tourism, distribution, all of this need to be addressed. An example actually is, for instance, the rules on drones. There are countries which have been penalizing the use of drones, or even the manufacture of drones. And for such countries, the drone industry hasn't taken off. But countries which have had facilitated regimes on drones, Rwanda, for instance, they are assembling drones. They are using drones to save lives, Yeah. So these processes are progressive, they are continuous. And we should present these issues as issues to be addressed, rather than issues which mean that it won't work, or we don't need to start on it at all. So that's the second point I wanted to make. Now, the last point that I would like to make is that leadership at the national level will be extremely important. This leadership is in government, of course, public sector. It's also leadership in the private sector. So that's why, for instance, it's heartening to hear that we've got more than a coalition of more than 200 companies that have come forward and say they would like to utilize the AFCFTA. We have these alliances of companies. So they are out to invest on the continent, to trade among themselves, to build regional value chains, trading intermediate products in order to utilize the AFCFTA and to make it work for everybody in an inclusive manner. So that's leadership in the private sector. We also need leadership in the academia to continuously educate people who go out into government, into the private sector, to utilize the AFCFTA to propagate it continuously, so to speak. So leadership is key. It will also help us to address all these teething problems, as well as operational problems, once the AFCFTA is negotiated. And by the way, any lawyer, if you present them with a problem, for instance, like the one about what happens to existing investments, they will give you an answer immediately. You can either have an instrument which is not retroactive, which doesn't work backwards. That's the standard practice. But there are exceptions. You can actually have an instrument which is retroactive. The current draft, for instance, says that any investment on the continent in place at the time of the entry into force of the protocol, but which is covered by the protocol, will be governed by the protocol. So the new rules will apply to existing investments, even those which have already been put in place, provided the investments are covered by the definition of investment in the protocol. Right. So in other words, what I'm saying is that we can be positive about this. There are always solutions to a problem. Even Gordian knots can be untied. You just need a sword.
That's a very nice place, Francis, for us to.
Back to you, Raj. And as I'm speaking for the last time, thank you so much for this event. Thanks to
the pleasure is mine. I think we're running a little bit out of time. In fact, we are 3 minutes over time.
Back to you. Yes.
And I want to give Andy and Ziad a minute each, and then so we can close up and allow people to go and get their dinner. I think we would like to keep talking, but I'm sure there are people who feel dinner is also equally important.
Yeah, so very quickly then, I just wanted to stress the centrality of this issue of cross-border investment for the agreement. If you look at all the simulation work that's been carried out on the benefits from liberalizing the tariffs on trade, you actually find that continental intra-African tariffs are not as high as people believe. The real challenges are the non-tariff barriers, and that's why the infrastructure issue is so crucial. And then I think the lack of cross-border investment on the continent. We need to see more of it. There's plenty of examples of good practice across the continent and where it's benefited receiving companies and outward investors as well, but we just need it in higher volumes than we've seen. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this investment protocol plays out. You can see from our discussion, there's quite a bit of uncertainty about certain elements about what's going to be finally decided. But I would just stress the centrality of this particular topic for the Continental Agreement to work.
Thank you, Andrew. And Ziad, you have the last word. Well, I have the last word, but semi-last word.
Right. I was going to pass on this opportunity for Andrew, actually, instead of going in last. the good thing about going in last is that most of your participants and panelists would have said most of it. For me, just 5 quick ones, bullets. The buy-in is important, and we have to focus on prior consultation and sensitization of the masses for the AFCFTA itself, but also for the AFCFTA investment laws to take off. The second is the need to standardize. We spoke about this. Standardization of the laws of investment will allow more people to come on well-known basis. We need to enforce the implementation and the dispute resolution mechanisms, as with all the other components of the AFCFTA. We need to provide a tool for unlocking African investment so that the AFCFTA investment protocols will not only benefit foreign investment, even though foreign can mean a lot of stuff, right? In Ghana, everything that is non-Ghanaian is foreign, even if you're an ECOWAS, but that's a different matter. So let us provide a tool for the AFTA investment to benefit the African-based investors. And last, let us look at the structural impediments that are underlying or eroding the competitiveness of African investments in the first place. Not necessarily investment related, but with effects into the investment, like the fees and charges and the other non-tax barriers. And with this one, I thank you very much, Raj, for a really nice discussion and engaging discussion.
Thank you so much, everybody. I cannot express my gratitude to the people who take time out of their busy lives to come and talk with us and change the way we think about the big issues. I want to just, in closing, apart from thanking everyone, to say the next October webinar is not, after all, going to be the Deputy Secretary General. She is being moved to November the 3rd due to her travel schedule. October the 6th, we will be listening to, we talk about how the economic rise of Africa will be negatively affected in the absence of universal healthcare. Healthcare is one of those key things that we take for granted, and I have a bunch of really interesting people from the public health field, from the medical field, to talk about how we can achieve public universal healthcare in Africa. So a slightly different topic, moving on to different things. November, we will have the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us. And please look forward to seeing you at next month's event, the first Thursday of every month. Remember, Dunning Africa Center, the webinar series, it's where we come here to have really interesting conversations about things that matter for tomorrow. Thank you, everybody.